Remember, peaceful protest.
Over 10,000 Nigerians murdered, hundreds of thousands more tortured. Between 1992 and 2021, Nigeria faced a silent assassin hunting its people from within. For nearly 30 years, violence, neglect, and abuse of power all shaped everyday life. But by 2020, patience had run out. This documentary asks a critical question. How did decades of neglect, state violence, and abuse of power in Nigeria lead to the #EndSARS movement? And how did youth-led resistance attempt to bring reform? This is the story of how silence turned into resistance. Let's start at the beginning. On the 1st of October 1960, the British Union Jack was lowered at Lagos Racecourse and Nigeria's new green-white-green flag was raised. Cheers filled the stadium. Princess Alexandria of Kent, in place of Queen Elizabeth II, handed the constitution to Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, now the first Prime Minister of Nigeria. As a natural reaction to decades of colonial rule, Nigeria had now become independent. Hope filled the air. Nigeria's independence was a promise of freedom, to build an inclusive, strong, functioning society. But the young democracy struggled. Ethnic tensions, corruption, and weak institutions led to coups. Jobs were scarce. Youth voices were ignored. Independence created hope, but weak institutions created instability, setting the stage for long-term neglect. After years of military rule, Nigeria returned to civilian government in 1999, but democracy did not heal everything. Despite immense oil wealth, poverty and unemployment remain widespread. According to the African Population Study, nearly 70% of Nigerians are under the age of 30, yet opportunities are scarce. Youth unemployment averaged nearly 23% between 2014 and 2023, spiking up to 53% in late 2020. Only about 1 in 5 schools had access to computers or reliable internet. Despite all this, technology remains vital in connecting many young Nigerians. By early 2023, there were 122.5 million internet users, 55% of the population. Social media gave voice to the neglected. In this space, reactions to injustice could no longer be silenced. Neglect set the stage for a new kind of protest. The trauma of dictatorship still haunts Nigeria. From the mid-1960s through the late 90s, a series of military regimes suspended constitutions, dissolved parliaments, and ruled by decree. A Human Rights Watch report notes that years of military rule produced economic collapse, political repression, and systematic human rights abuses. Journalists were killed, activists disappeared, and ordinary people feared a knock on the door at night. Despite the return of democracy, national security was at risk. As the years passed, each broken promise created a new reaction. For decades, Nigerians were told reform was coming, only they hadn't seen it. In 1992, a division of the police was created to combat armed robbery, SARS, the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. Despite their noble creation, SARS almost immediately incorporated the use of state violence, and it would only get worse over the years. The Human Rights Watch estimates that over 10,000 people were killed by Nigerian police in just 7 years between 2000 and 2007, and a large portion of these murders were done by SARS. The methods SARS used reflected a strong pattern. According to Al Jazeera, many were targeted for owning valuables like luxury cars, laptops, and iPhones. When SARS found a victim, they would often overpower them by showing up in large armed groups. Once their target had been cornered, it was common for them to threaten their victims, threats of disposing of them or their families. If they refused to listen, the victims were killed. If they did listen, they would be robbed of all their valuables and subjected to SARS's torture methods, including binding victims' limbs behind their backs and beating them, electrocution, and humiliation. In addition to their valuables, for them to just have a chance at being free, victims were forced to pay absurdly high prices. Multiple victims reported SARS demanding fines of up to 80,000 naira. While this only translated to roughly $200, at the time 80,000 naira was equivalent to over 1 year of the average person's income. While they often settled for less, for those who could not pay, it often meant that they would disappear, never to be heard of again. These abuses reflect a pattern. the use of violence to maintain power and silence dissent. Countless Nigerians felt helpless. After all, what could they do against the strongest power in the nation? But there was a saving grace for the country: the youth. You see, the older generations had grown up with their early dictatorships in power. One wrong move and you would disappear forever. However, the youth didn't experience that. They grew up in a much freer country. Sure, the government was unstable and the case of SARS very present, but unlike the adults, instead of feeling helpless, they felt empowered. The true value of the youth could first be seen in 2017, when the situation had reached a breaking point. SARS had been abusing their power for decades now, and a certain group of people had had enough. At this point, the abuse of power by SARS made everyday life dangerous. When Nigerians began posting their horrifying experiences with SARS on social media platforms, especially Twitter, it began to snowball. One person's experience became 2, then 10, and suddenly thousands of Nigerians had shared what SARS had done to them. The situation continued to gain great attention throughout the rest of 2017. That year, a new hashtag took over, seemingly from nowhere. That was #EndSARS. With more and more people internationally learning about SARS each day, the youth began to take action. Over the course of the next 3 years and with the use of social media, petitions were signed, urging the government to disband SARS. Celebrities joined in, using their fame to bring awareness to the issue, and most importantly, people began to plan protests. On October 3rd, 2020, a video circulated online showing SARS officers shooting a young man in Delta State. Less than a week later, Jimo Isaac was shot dead by SARS while protesting. The people were furious. Within days, thousands of young Nigerians took to the streets of Lagos and Abuja, chanting, "End SARS." They rallied around a couple demands: the release of detained protesters, justice and compensations for victims of police brutality, retraining of officers, and the prosecution of abusive ones. On October 11th, the Nigerian police force announced that SARS would be dissolved immediately, and all operations would be ceased. However, this wasn't the first time the Nigerian people had heard this. In fact, SARS had already been announced to have been dismantled 4 times before this. Nigerians simply didn't believe such an empty promise. They stayed true to their cause and kept protesting for their freedoms. 2 days later, their worries proved to be correct when it was announced that SARS would officially be replaced by SWAT, the Special Weapons and Tactics Team. Nigerians were worried that this was merely a substitution, that the same officers would simply switch uniforms and corruption would appear under a different alias. In addition to the End SARS trend, End SWAT also began making rounds online. And so protests continued. During this time, digital activism transformed reaction into organized resistance. Most protesters used Twitter, Instagram, and WhatsApp to coordinate. Others used it to live stream and raise funds. Many volunteers provided food, medical care, and legal aid. The movement was decentralized. There was no leader or organization. Everyone was simply unified under one banner: to end police brutality and implement impactful reforms. And this wasn't just limited to people inside Nigeria, rather, thousands of people outside of the nation were also showing their support. People, even celebrities like then CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, Rihanna, and Kanye West all used their platforms to spread awareness of SARS and to send their support to Nigerians from across the globe. But with tens of thousands of protesters, what was the reaction from the government? The answer? Violence. On October 20th, 2020, soldiers left their base at 6:29 p.m. local time and arrived at Lekki Tollgate at about 6:45 p.m., where over 2,000 unarmed protesters had gathered. CCTV cameras were dismantled and the lights were turned off. The crowd was confused and concerned. Within seconds, however, witnesses saw soldiers surround the protesters and shoot, leaving at least 15 bodies lifeless. Many Nigerians documented this event on social media, including DJ Switch, who live-streamed the massacre, showing the bullets and victims on Instagram. Protests continued the next day, but so did the police. Reports of tens more protesters being shot and killed continued throughout the day. However, the situation had begun to calm down. The incident at Lekki Tollgate put fear into all young Nigerian hearts. At the same time, the government had now seen the power of protesters, not just within Nigeria, but internationally. Following the events on October 21st, judicial panels were formed, but recommendations have been slow to implement. The creation of SWAT and lack of accountability represented the limitations of reform. Changing acronyms without addressing root causes, neglect, state violence, and the abuse of power. These all lead to superficial reforms. Citizens reacted not only to police brutality, but to decades of promise broken by silence.